An untamable horse is sold at auction, but what the old rancher did left everyone in total shock. The crowd laughed when the gavel fell. No one believed a crippled old rancher could handle the wild black stallion that had thrown every rider. Dust swirled in the corral. The church bell echoed in the distance. Then the unthinkable happened. The horse bowed its head to the rancher's hand, and silence fell across the town. But this was no ordinary horse. Hidden in its past was a stolen truth, a truth that would bring an Apache rider to the rancher's door, demanding what was his. Now the town whispers of treachery. The wealthy cattle baron sharpens his claim, and the marshal weighs law against justice. Barns will burn, faith will be tested, and a bond stronger than blood will be forged in the fire. What happens when mercy defies fear, and an old man risks everything for a horse, a stranger, and the truth? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The morning sun beat down on Trinidad's main street as wagons creaked to a stop near the auction corral. Thomas Harper stood in the shade of the mercantile, his weathered hand resting on his cane while he watched the growing crowd. The excitement in the air was thick as molasses, with townspeople gathering in clusters to whisper and point at the upcoming spectacle. Ain't natural. That horse, muttered old Bill Jenkins as he passed. Broke my nephew's arm last month when he tried to saddle him, Thomas observed silently as the massive black stallion was led into the corral. The animal's coat gleamed like polished coal despite the sweat that lathered its flanks. Its eyes rolled white with fury, nostrils flaring as it fought against the lead rope. The wranglers struggled to control it, their boots scraping through the dust as they worked to secure the gate. $10 says it throws another man before sundown, called out Jimmy Watson from his perch on the fence. Laughter rippled through the crowd as more bets were placed, coins changing hands freely. The auctioneer, red-faced and portly, climbed onto his platform and rang his bell. Ladies and gentlemen, we begin with this fine specimen of horseflesh. Though I must warn you, this here stallion has proved more devil than horse. 3 broken arms, 2 crushed feet, and enough bruised pride to fill a church on Sunday. More laughter followed, but Thomas noticed how the men kept their distance from the fence. The stallion paced the corral like a caged storm, its hooves striking sparks from the occasional stone. Who'll start the bidding at $50? The auctioneer called out. Its voice echoed across suddenly silent faces. No hands rose. The stallion screamed its defiance, causing several women to step back with small cries of alarm. $40. The auctioneer's voice held a note of desperation. Surely this fine animal is worth $40 to someone. Thomas straightened slowly, his bad hip protesting the movement. I'll give you 30, he said, his quiet voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. Heads turned. Whispers rustled like dry leaves. Old Harper's gone soft in the head, someone muttered, drawing scattered chuckles. The auctioneer blinked. In surprise, $30 from Thomas Harper. Do I hear 35? Silence fell again, broken only by the stallion's angry snorts and the scrape of its hooves against packed earth. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice uncertain. Going twice, old man called Dick Wilson, the livery stable owner. You aim to kill yourself. That beast ain't fit for nothing but dog food. Thomas pulled his coin purse from his vest pocket, counting out the money with careful deliberation. The silver dollars clicked softly as he placed them in the auctioneer's damp palm. Much obliged, Thomas said quietly. Then he turned to the wranglers, still holding the lead rope. Would you kindly open the gate? Mr. Harper, one of them protested. You can't go in there. It's horse. He's got the devil in him, sure as Sunday. Thomas's weathered face creased in a gentle smile. The gate, if you please. The crowd drew back as Thomas limped toward the corral. Women clutched their children closer. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The wranglers exchanged worried glances, but slowly pulled the gate open, keeping the lead rope taut. Thomas stepped into the corral, his cane making small divots in the dust. The stallion's ears flattened against its skull as it watched him approach. Without hesitation, Thomas reached for the lead rope and untied the knot, holding the bridle in place. The leather fell away, and the wranglers scrambled backward, slamming the gate behind them. "He's dead for certain," someone whispered. But Thomas paid no attention to the voices. He lowered himself carefully to one knee, ignoring the protest in his hip. The stallion's nostrils flared as it caught his scent. It paced in a tight circle, hooves striking the ground with enough force to raise small clouds of dust. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, his voice barely carrying to the spellbound crowd. "No one here's going to hurt you." The stallion snorted, tossing its proud head. But something in Thomas's calm presence seemed to reach it. Its circles grew wider, less frantic. The tension in its muscles began to ease. Thomas remained perfectly still. One hand extended palm up, speaking soft words that the crowd strained to hear. Minutes stretched like warm taffy as the horse gradually worked its way closer to where he knelt. Then, in a moment that drew gasps from every throat, the stallion stopped its pacing. Its ears swiveled forward. With delicate care, it stretched its neck out and touched its velvet nose to Thomas's waiting hand. A small voice broke the stunned silence. "Mama, look." He tamed it with a touch. Little Sarah Miller's words seemed to break some spell. The crowd erupted in amazed murmurs as Thomas slowly rose to his feet, keeping his hand on the stallion's nose. The horse remained calm, its dark eyes now holding a glimmer of trust instead of fury. The auctioneer mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Well, I never sales final then, Mr. Harper." Though how you managed, Thomas simply nodded, gently running his hand along the stallion's neck. The horse lowered its head, allowing him to grasp its mane. With the same unhurried patience he'd shown throughout, Thomas began leading the stallion toward the gate. The crowd parted before them like water, their whispers following in his wake. "Did you see that? Never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Must be some kind of horse whisperer." The evening sun painted long shadows across the street as Thomas and his new companion made their way home. A small parade of curious onlookers followed at a respectful distance, still marveling at the transformation they'd witnessed. The stallion walked beside Thomas with its head lowered, its stride matching the old rancher's limping gait as if they'd been partners for years instead of minutes. The last rays of sunlight caught the dust motes swirling in their wake. Turning, them two floating gold as horse and man disappeared around the bend. Leaving the townsfolk to wonder at what they'd seen in the auction corral that remarkable afternoon, Thomas Harper led the black stallion down Trinidad's main street, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The evening breeze carried whispers from the small crowd that trailed behind them at a cautious distance. The horse's hooves clicked softly on scattered stones, its head lowered to match Thomas's slower pace. "Never seen anything like it, Martha," Wilson said to her neighbor, shaking her head in wonder. "That horse nearly killed Jim Peterson's boy last month." The stallion's ears twitched at the voices, but it remained calm beside Thomas, who kept the lead rope slack between them. His weathered fingers occasionally brushed the horse's shoulder, each touch gentle as a father's blessing at the livery. Stable, Thomas paused. The building's weathered boards cast long shadows in the fading light, and the familiar sense of hay and leather drifted through the wide doors. Dick Wilson, the stable owner, watched from his doorway with arms crossed. His expression caught between concern and curiosity. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of oats. The stallion's nostrils flared at the scent, but it made no sudden moves. With infinite patience, Thomas held his palm flat, letting the horse lip the grain from his hand. The animal's whiskers tickled his skin, its breath warm against his fingers. Young Bobby Jenkins, no more than 12 years old, edged closer. His eyes were wide with wonder beneath the brim of his too-large hat. "How'd you do it, Mr. Harper?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "How'd you make it gentle so quick?" Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he offered the stallion another handful of oats. "Mercy tames what fear never could, son," he said simply. Several of the men gathered nearby scoffed. "That's fool talk," muttered Pete Davidson, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Horse like that needs a firm hand and a strong bit." But others nodded thoughtfully, particularly those who had witnessed the transformation in the auction corral. Sarah Miller's father, a quiet man who worked the telegraph office, spoke up. "Reckon there might be something to that, Pete. Ain't? None of us ever got near that horse without it trying to kill us. As they talked, lanterns began to flicker to life along Main Street. Their golden glow pushed back the gathering dusk, casting warm circles on the wooden sidewalks. Thomas checked the harness on his wagon, making sure everything was secure for the long ride home. With careful movements, he tied the stallion to the back of the wagon. The horse accepted the rope without protest, though its dark eyes followed Thomas's every move. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat, his bad hip complaining at the effort. He gathered the reins of his two draft horses, both solid brown animals, that had served him faithfully for years. "Evening, folks," he called softly to the watching crowd. Then he clicked his tongue, and the wagon rolled forward into the deepening twilight. The road home stretched long before him, rutted from recent rains and wagon wheels. The stallion's hoofbeats created a steady rhythm behind the wagon, a counterpoint to the creak of leather and wood. Above, stars began to pierce the darkening sky, bright as silver dollars scattered across blue velvet dot. Thomas spoke quietly to the horse as they traveled, his voice carrying back through the cool evening air. "You remind me of another black horse," he said, "one my John rode in the cavalry. Beautiful animal, proud as you are, speed like wind over water." The memory of his son sent a familiar ache through his chest. John had been so young, so full of life and dreams. The cavalry had seemed like an adventure to him, a chance to serve his country and see the world beyond Trinidad's dusty streets. "He'd have liked you," Thomas continued, his voice growing rough. "Had a way with horses, just like his mama. Always said it was about understanding them, not breaking them." The stallion nickered softly in response, as if acknowledging the weight of shared grief in the old man's words. The wagon jolted through a deep rut, and Thomas fell silent, lost in memories of better days. Finally, the broken gate of his ranch came into view. The fence posts leaned at tired angles, and patches of tar paper on the barn roof showed black against the weathered wood. Thomas hadn't had the heart to keep up with repairs since John's death, and his bad hip made the work twice. As hard, he guided the wagon into the barnyard, gravel crunching under the wheels. The stallion's head came up, nostrils flaring as it took in the sense of its new home. Thomas carefully unhitched his draft horses first, leading them to their familiar stalls. Their comfortable munching filled the barn as they settled into their evening feed. The empty stall at the far end had been John's pride and joy, built special for his cavalry mount. Thomas had kept it clean over the years, though it had stood empty since the telegram came. Now he led the black stallion to stand in the doorway, letting it inspect its new home. The horse stepped forward cautiously, testing the straw-covered floor, its ears swiveled, taking in every sound. Thomas waited patiently until it walked fully into the stall, then latched the door with care. "There now," he murmured, "safe and sound." In the kitchen of his small house, Thomas lit the lamp. On the table, its light fell across the single plate he set out, casting long shadows on the worn tablecloth. A pot of beans warmed on the stove, filling the room with their simple aroma. He cut a thick slice of bread from yesterday's loaf and poured a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he was at the auction. Before eating, Thomas bowed his head. His calloused hands folded together as naturally as a barn door closing. "Lord," he prayed quietly, "thank you for the gift of this day and for this creature you've brought into my care. I don't rightly know why you led me to that auction, but I trust your purpose. Give me wisdom to handle what storms may come. And Lord, watch over my boy, wherever he rests." A lonely neigh drifted from the barn, echoing across the yard. The stallion was restless in its new surroundings, but the wild fury that had marked it at the auction was gone. Thomas lifted his head, listening to the sound. It reminded him so much of other nights, other horses, other prayers spoken over. Cooling suppers, he ate slowly, each bite measured and deliberate. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, and his shadow on the wall seemed to hold the weight of all his years. But there was peace in his movements, acceptance in the lines of his face. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he had done what he knew was right. The horse called again, softer this time, as if settling into its new home. Thomas nodded to himself, understanding the need for time to adjust to change. Some things couldn't be rushed, whether taming a wild heart or healing an old wound. Both required patience and mercy. And faith that morning would bring a better day. Dawn crept over the eastern hills, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Thomas Harper eased himself out of bed, his hips stiff from the previous day's activities. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he made his way to the kitchen, where he stirred the embers in the cook stove and set coffee to boil. Steam rose from his tin mug as he limped across the barnyard. Morning dew dampened his boots, and roosters called from the chicken coop. The barn door groaned on its hinges as he pushed it open, letting in streams of early light that cut through the dusty air. The black stallion's head appeared over the stall door, ears pricked forward. Those dark eyes, wild with fury just yesterday, now held a cautious interest. Thomas approached slowly, speaking in low, even tones. "Morning to you," he said, setting his coffee on a nearby barrel. "Let's see how you're settling in." The horse stamped one hoof, but made no aggressive moves as Thomas unlatched the stall door. Taking a curry brush from his pocket, Thomas held it where the stallion could see and smell it. After a moment's hesitation, the horse allowed him to begin grooming its gleaming coat. "There now," Thomas murmured, working tangles from the thick black mane. "Ain't so terrible, is it?" The morning routine proceeded peacefully. Thomas fed his animals, taking extra care with the new addition. The stallion accepted hay and grain without the savage displays that had marked its behavior at the auction. Though still wary, it showed signs of accepting its new circumstances. After the morning chores, Thomas hitched his old mule Jenny to the wagon. The faithful animal stood quietly in the traces, drowsing in the warming sun while Thomas checked the harness one final time. He needed supplies from town, though he wasn't looking forward to facing the gossip his purchase had surely stirred up. The ride into Trinidad took nearly an hour, Jenny plodding along at her own steady pace. Thomas used the time to plan his supply list: flour, coffee, sugar, maybe some tobacco if he could spare the coins. The wagon rattled over ruts in the dirt road, each bump sending twinges through his hip. By the time they reached town, the streets were busy with morning traffic. Thomas pulled up in front of the mercantile, tying Jenny to the hitching post. He could feel eyes following him as he climbed down from the wagon, could hear the whispers starting up behind raised hands. "Old fool," a voice carried clearly from the saloon porch, "that beast'll kill him, sure as sunrise." Thomas kept his face neutral, heading into the store with measured steps. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Mr. Peterson looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Thomas," the shopkeeper said cautiously. "Heard about your purchase yesterday? Reckon you did." Thomas picked up a basket and began selecting his items. Whole town's probably heard by now. He was examining a sack of flour when Pastor Samuel Duggan approached. The circuit preacher's face showed concern beneath his gray beard. "Brother Harper," he said quietly. "A word, if you please." Thomas straightened slowly, his hip protesting. "Of course, Pastor. I must urge caution, Thomas." The preacher's eyes were worried that Stallion has a fearsome reputation. 3 men hurt trying to break it, 1 nearly killed. And you, with your injury, much obliged for your concern. Thomas replied evenly. "But the Lord seems to have given me away with the creature." Pastor Duggan opened his mouth as if to say more, then simply nodded. Thomas finished his shopping. In silence, paid Mr. Peterson and carried his supplies out to the wagon. He was loading the last sack when a shadow fell across the wagon bed. Thomas turned to find a young Apache man standing nearby, thin but straight-backed with dignity. Despite worn clothes that spoke of hard times, he carried himself with quiet pride. "Horse is mine," the young man said in halting English, gesturing toward Thomas's ranch. "Black horse. Cavalry took him." Thomas studied the stranger's face. Behind him, a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the confrontation. The young man met Thomas's gaze steadily, and in those dark eyes Thomas saw not threat or arrogance, but deep loss. "Loss. Name's Taza," the Apache continued. "Horse was father's gift. Army raiders came. Took horse. Took me." His hand touched his chest. "Prison 2 years. Now free. Come for horse." Whispers rippled through the growing crowd. Thomas recognized some of the faces: men who'd been at the auction, women who'd seen his gentle handling of the stallion. "That's one of them prison Indians," Bill Turner called out. "Don't trust him, Harper. Probably escaped." "You can't give him that horse," another voice added. "You paid good money for it." Thomas held up his hand for quiet, never taking his eyes from Taz's face. Young man hadn't moved, hadn't shown anger at the accusations. He simply waited, his bearing speaking of both patience and determination. After a long moment, Thomas spoke. "Come to my ranch," he said clearly. "Share supper. Tell your story proper." A burst of protest came from the crowd. "Harper, you can't harbor an Indian. He'll steal you blind. Them prison breaks are dangerous." Thomas turned to face the townspeople, his voice firm but calm. "Man's got a right to speak his piece," he said, "and I've got a right to hear it." Stepping closer to Taza, Thomas gestured to the wagon seat. The young Apache hesitated only briefly before climbing up. Thomas followed more slowly, his bad hip making the ascent awkward. "You're making a mistake, Harper," Bill Turner called as Thomas gathered the reins. "That Indian cut your throat in your sleep." Thomas clicked to Jenny, and the wagon rolled. Forward, he could feel the weight of worried stares and angry glares following them down the street. Beside him, Taza sat straight and still, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as they left town behind. Thomas noticed how the young man's shoulders gradually relaxed, though his posture remained proud. Neither spoke for several minutes, letting the creak of wagon wheels and the jingle of harness fill the silence. Finally, Thomas said quietly, "Reckon you and that stallion might have more in common than folks would guess. It's both been treated harsh by those who should have shown better judgment." Taza turned slightly, studying the old rancher's profile. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, followed by something deeper, a cautious hope, perhaps, or the first seed of trust. The wagon rolled on toward Thomas's ranch, carrying its unlikely passengers through the morning sun. Behind them, the town buzzed with fresh gossip about old Thomas Harper's latest fool notion. But Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead, knowing in his heart he'd chosen right. The last mile passed in companionable silence, broken only by Jenny's steady hoofbeats and the distant cry of a hawk riding the warming thermals. Thomas's decision might bring storms, but mercy demanded no less. Sometimes, he reflected, the hardest part of following the good book's teachings was simply being willing to listen when others would turn away. The afternoon sun beat down, mercilessly as Thomas's wagon creaked along the dusty road toward home. Taza sat straight-backed beside him, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where Thomas's ranch lay. Neither man spoke much, letting the rhythmic clop of Jenny's hooves and the rattle of wagon wheels fill the silence. Dust rose in choking clouds around them, coating their clothes and settling in their throats. Thomas pulled his bandana up over his nose, offering a spare one to Taza, who accepted with a slight nod. The young Apache's dignity remained undiminished by the discomfort of the journey, his bearing as proud as when they'd left town. The old mule plodded steadily onward, seemingly unbothered by the heat that had both men sweating. Thomas kept stealing glances at his companion, noting how Taza's eyes would scan the surrounding countryside with the practiced awareness of one used to reading the land. There was something familiar in that careful attention, something that reminded Thomas of his own son's vigilance, learned during his cavalry years as they crested the final rise before the ranch. Taza straightened even further, his gaze fixed on the corral where the black stallion stood. The horse's head came up at their approach, ears pricking forward with interest. "May I?" Taza asked quietly, gesturing toward the corral once Thomas had brought the wagon to a halt in the yard. Thomas nodded, watching as the young man climbed down with fluid grace. "Go ahead. Reckon you two might have some catching up to do." Taza approached the corral slowly, speaking soft words in Apache that Thomas couldn't understand. The stallion's reaction, however, needed no translation. The horse nickered softly, moving toward the fence with none of the wild-eyed fury it had shown at the auction. Recognition sparked in its dark eyes as Taza drew closer. Thomas eased himself down from the wagon, his hip protesting the movement. He stood quietly, watching as Taza reached the fence. The stallion stretched its neck over the rails, nostrils flaring as it caught the young man's scent. Taza raised his hand slowly, letting the horse catch his familiar smell. The stallion's muzzle touched Taza's palm with surprising gentleness. More Apache words flowed from the young man's lips, soft and melodic, as he stroked the horse's face. The animal's eyes half closed in contentment, a far cry from the savage beast that had terrified the Kate townspeople. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he watched them. The truth was plain to see in every gesture, every response between man and horse. This was no stranger claiming someone else's property. This was a reunion. "Reckon you're probably hungry," Thomas said after a while, not wanting to interrupt, but knowing they needed to settle things. Got beans warming on the stove and fresh cornbread. Taza gave the horse one final pat before turning. "Thank you," he said simply, following Thomas toward the house. Inside, Thomas's kitchen was spare, but tidy. 2 plates sat ready on the worn table alongside tin cups and utensils. The beans bubbled in their pot on the cook stove, and the cornbread sat golden brown in its cast-iron skillet. Thomas served them both, then lowered himself carefully into his chair. "I always bow my head before eating," he explained, watching Taza to thank the Lord for his provision. "You're welcome to join me, or wait, as you prefer." Taza hesitated only briefly before inclining his head. Thomas bowed his own, speaking the familiar words of grace with quiet reverence. When he looked up, he found Taza waiting patiently, showing respect for his host's customs. They ate in silence at first, the simple food filling empty stomachs. Through the open window came the evening sounds of the ranch chickens settling in their coop, the soft whicker of horses, a distant coyote testing the coming dusk with an early yip. "Horse was gift," Taza said finally, breaking the quiet. "From father, when I became man. 2 summers passed, soldiers came. Many horses, many men in blue." His face showed no anger, but his eyes held old pain. "They took horses, took me," said. "I was spy." Thomas set down his spoon, the beans suddenly tasteless in his mouth. "When was this raid?" he asked carefully. 2 years passed. "Month of yellow flowers. August," Thomas said heavily. 2 years ago, he drew a deep breath. "My son rode with those soldiers." The words hung between them, heavy as storm clouds. Taza's face remained impassive, but his hands stilled on the table. "James, my boy, he wrote me about it." Thomas continued quietly. "Said it didn't set right with him, taking horses and men without proper cause. He was killed 3 months later, in a skirmish up north." Taza's eyes met his, understanding passing between them. Both had lost something precious to the same conflict, the same choices made by men in authority. "I am sorry," Taza said simply. "For your son?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Outside, a chorus of coyotes began their evening song, their wild voices echoing off the hills. The sound carried memories of other nights, other suppers shared with family now gone. When they'd finished eating, Thomas cleared the plates. The sun had set, painting the sky in deep purples and fading gold. In the growing darkness, the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms. "Got a spare cot in the bunkhouse," Thomas said, knowing the decision would raise eyebrows in town, but unable to do otherwise. "It's yours if you want it. Warm blankets, roof that don't leak much." Taza accepted with quiet dignity, following Thomas to the empty bunkhouse. The building had housed ranch hands in better times before Thomas's injury had forced him to scale back operations. Now it stood mostly unused, though well-maintained, after showing Taza where to find everything he might need. Thomas returned to his house. The evening's events weighed heavily on his mind as he lit the lamp on his desk. Taking out his worn Bible, he opened it to a blank margin and picked up his pencil. After a moment's thought, he wrote in careful letters, "Mercy is costlier than." The words seemed to glow in the lamplight, their truth settling into his heart. Outside his window, he could see the black stallion standing at the corral fence, its head turned toward the bunkhouse where Taza slept. The horse's posture was relaxed, showing none of the tension it had carried before. It stood as if keeping watch over both properties, the ranch that had offered shelter and the man who had given it its first taste of freedom. Thomas extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, his movements slowed by his aching hip and the day's exertions. Through his open window came the night sounds of the ranch crickets chirping, the soft shuffling of horses, the distant call of coyotes in the hills, and underneath it all, a sense of rightness. Despite the complications he knew would come, the cost of mercy might be high. He reflected as he lay down, but the price of turning away would have been far higher. Sometimes the Lord's guidance led down unexpected paths, toward understanding that crossed the boundaries men built between themselves. The rooster's crow split the dawn silence, calling Thomas from his bed. His hip was stiff, but the familiar ache couldn't dim his sense of purpose. Through the window, he saw Taza already up, standing in the yard. Face turned toward the rising sun, Thomas pulled on his boots and made his way outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of sage and prairie grass. Dew sparkled on fence posts and wagon wheels, catching the first golden rays of daylight. "Morning," Thomas called softly. "Reckon it's time I showed you how we run things here." Taza nodded, falling into step beside him. They started with the barn, where Thomas demonstrated the morning milking. The cow shifted restlessly at Taza's unfamiliar presence, but Thomas's gentle murmurs kept her calm. "Here," Thomas said, gesturing to the wooden stool. "You try." Taza's strong hands were quick to learn the rhythm. Soon, warm milk was streaming steadily into the pail. Thomas noticed how the young man whispered to the cow in Apache, the strange words somehow soothing to the animal. "What did you say to her?" Thomas asked. "Called her sister," Taza explained. "All creatures are kin." They moved on to the well, hauling water for the stock tanks. Thomas watched as Taza's wiry frame handled the heavy buckets with ease. Despite his recent imprisonment, there was strength in him, and more importantly, a willingness to work. "Water," Thomas said clearly, pointing to the liquid sloshing in the bucket. "Tuha," Taza responded, then gestured upward. "Sun is Shah." And so it went through the morning's work. For every English word Thomas offered, Taza shared its Apache equivalent. Sky became Ya, while horse was Jika. The language lesson continued as they mended a broken section of fence. Thomas showing Taza how to stretch the wire tight between posts. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs as they worked. Thomas found himself impressed by Taza's quick mind and careful attention to detail. The young man missed nothing, asking questions when needed, but mostly learning through quiet observation. When noon approached, Thomas led the way back to the house. On the kitchen table, he'd placed his old Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. They sat down to a simple meal of cold biscuits and jerky, and Thomas opened the book. "My ma taught me to read with this," he explained, running his finger beneath the words. "Reckon it might help you learn too." Taza leaned forward, dark eyes intent on the page as Thomas began to read slowly. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The Apache youth repeated each phrase carefully, his accent thick, but his determination clear. When he stumbled over a word, Thomas would say it again, breaking it into smaller parts until Taza could manage it. After the lesson, he returned to the corral where the black stallion waited. This time, it was Taza's turn to teach. He showed Thomas how to approach the horse from an angle, never straight on, respecting its need to see clearly. "Horse thinks like prey," Taza explained, demonstrating the careful movements. "Must show. We are friend, not hunter." Thomas watched as Taza gathered handful of long grass, offering it to the stallion while standing slightly sideways. The horse's ears pricked forward with interest, but it didn't tense or shy away. "Your people have always known horses better than mine," Thomas admitted, copying Taza's stance. Together, they groomed the stallion, Taza showing Thomas how to read the animal's subtle signals. When the horse accepted their touch without flinching, they rewarded it with gentle words and more grass. The afternoon passed peacefully, punctuated by shared words in both languages and the soft nickering of satisfied horses. As evening approached, Thomas and Taza sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The day's work had left them tired but content. Sharing a comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of Thomas's rocking chair, the peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared from the direction of town, his fine bay horse and expensive saddle marking him as someone of means. Thomas recognized Clive Morton, one of the largest ranchers in the territory. Morton reined his horse to a stop in front of the porch, not bothering to dismount. His eyes flickered over Taza with barely concealed disdain before settling on Thomas. "Evening, Harper," Morton said, his tone falsely pleasant. "Heard about that stallion you bought yesterday? Fine piece of horseflesh. That one?" Thomas nodded, but said nothing, watching Morton carefully. "I'm prepared to offer you twice what you paid for it," Morton continued. "Cash money, right here and now." "Much obliged," Thomas replied quietly, "but the horse ain't for sale." Morton's facade of friendliness cracked slightly. "Come now, Harper, be reasonable. What use has an old man like you got for a horse like that? Better it should go to a proper breeding operation." "I said it ain't for sale," Thomas repeated firmly. Morton's face hardened, and his gaze shifted deliberately to Taza. "Word in town is you're harboring an escaped prisoner. That true, Harper?" "Hass is here as my guest," Thomas answered, his voice level but steel-edged. "And the horse stays too." Morton's lip curled slightly. "A horse like that don't belong with an old man and a prison Indian." He gathered his reins tight. "You'll regret this stubborn streak, Harper. Mark my words." They watched as Morton wheeled his horse around and rode away, dust rising behind him in the golden evening light. Silence settled back over the ranch, broken only by the soft evening breeze and the distant call of a meadowlark. "Why, help me?" Taza asked quietly, his dark eyes searching Thomas's weathered face. Thomas was silent for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue above. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with old pain, "Because no one helped my boy when he needed it." The words hung in the twilight air between them, heavy with meaning. More stars emerged overhead, pricking the darkening sky with their ancient light. Neither man spoke again. But something had shifted between them, understanding deeper than words in either language could express. The black stallion moved in its corral, its coat catching the last gleam of daylight. It stood, watching them both. No longer the wild creature of yesterday, but something transformed by patience and trust, like the stars appearing one by one above. Change was coming slowly but surely to the Harper Ranch. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the church bells of Trinidad calling across the prairie like bronze-voiced birds. Thomas Harper stood in his kitchen, straightening his frayed string tie in the window's reflection while coffee burbled on the wood stove through the open door. He could see Taza hovering uncertainly near the barn, dressed in his cleanest work clothes. The young Apache had been up since first light, helping with chores so they could make it to town for services. "Best get moving," Thomas called, limping out onto the porch. "Need to hitch up old Bessie before the bells stop ringing." He watched Taz's face carefully as he added, "Reckon you ought to come along today." Taz's dark eyes flickered with doubt. "Church is for your people. Church is for anyone seeking the Lord," Thomas replied gently. "And folks need to see you as more than just a stranger passing through." After a moment's hesitation, Taza nodded. Together, they hitched the elderly mule to the wagon, her bones nearly as creaky as Thomas's own. The morning air was sweet with sage as they set out, wagon wheels leaving twin trails in the dusty road as they approached town. More wagons and riders joined the flow of traffic, heading toward the white-painted church. Thomas noticed how conversations died when people spotted Taza beside him. Mothers pulled children closer, and men's hands drifted toward gun belts. They tied up at the hitching rail, and Thomas straightened his shoulders before leading the way up the church steps. The usual greeting committee fell silent as Taza followed him through the door. Inside, the pine pews were already filling with Sunday-best dresses and polished boots. Thomas chose his usual spot near the back, making room for Taza beside him. The whispers spread like wind through dry grass. Several families shifted pointedly to other pews. From the front row, Clive Morton turned to stare, his face dark with disapproval. Pastor Duggan emerged from the vestry, his eyes widening slightly. At the sight of Taza, but recovering quickly, he nodded to them both before taking his place at the pulpit. As the organ wheezed to life for the opening hymn, Thomas handed Taza his extra hymnal, pointing to the correct page. "Just follow along." "Best you can," he murmured. The congregation rose to sing Rock of Ages, but many voices faltered when they realized Taza was attempting to join in. Though his pronunciation was uncertain, he tried to follow Thomas's lead, earning more than a few scandalized looks. Throughout the service, Thomas could feel the tension in the room, thick as August heat. Pastor Dugan preached about loving one's neighbor, his eyes occasionally drifting toward their pew. Whether by coincidence or divine providence, Thomas couldn't say. But he appreciated the message. When the final amen was said, Pastor Dugan made his way down the aisle to greet them, while most of the congregation hurried outside. His handshake was warm as he welcomed Taza to the church. "We're glad to have you join us today," the pastor said, though Thomas noted the careful way he glanced at the door where a crowd was gathering. "Much obliged for the welcome," Thomas replied. Knowing what was coming, they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, where a group of townsmen waited. Morton stood at their center, his Sunday suit doing nothing to soften his hard expression. One of the older ranchers spoke up. "We need to have words." Thomas nodded calmly. "Speak your piece. Then?" "You're fixing to lose what little standing you got left in this town," another man warned. "Taking in strays is one thing, but bringing an Indian prisoner to church? That's gone too far." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Morton stepped forward, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "You're making a mockery of everything decent folks stand for, Harper. That boy belongs back behind bars, where that's enough." Thomas cut in, his quiet voice somehow stronger than winning Marnie. "When why stronger than?" Morton's bluster. "This young man is under my roof. Until I see wrong in him, I'll treat him as kin." The word kin caused a fresh wave of muttering, but Thomas stood his ground. He felt Taza's presence beside him, steady as a rock wall. "You're a fool, Harper." Morton spat. "And you'll pay dear for it." The crowd began to disperse, though dark looks followed them as Thomas and Taza made their way back to the wagon. The drive home was quiet, but Thomas could see Taza processing everything he'd witnessed, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Thomas suggested they head out to the meadow. The afternoon sun was gentle as they led the black stallion from its corral, carrying a well-worn saddle. "Time we see if he remembers his training," Thomas said. Letting the horse smell the leather, the stallion's ears flicked forward with interest, but showed no sign of panic. Carefully, Thomas draped a blanket across its back, then the saddle, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Taza watched intently, speaking soft words in Apache when the horse shifted to their surprise. The stallion accepted the saddle with only minimal fidgeting. Thomas tightened the cinch gradually, praising the horse's patience. After several minutes of groundwork, he gathered the reins in his hand. "Well, no time like the present," he murmured, and carefully swung into the saddle. They all held their breath, Thomas, Taza, and even the horse seemed to pause. Then, with remarkable gentleness, the stallion began walking in a slow circle. Its steps were careful, as if remembering long-ago lessons. "He remembers," Taza said softly, his face bright with joy. "Was cavalry mount before. Good training stays in blood." Thomas rode for several minutes, keeping the horse at a walk, letting it remember that carrying a rider could be peaceful work. When he finally dismounted, his bad hip was aching. But his heart was light. The sun was setting as they returned to the ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas and Taza settled on the porch with the remains of the mornings, bread and a pot of coffee. As was becoming their custom, Thomas offered a quiet prayer of thanks before they ate. The evening air was still, heavy with the promise of summer. Far to the west, dark clouds gathered beyond the ridgeline. Thomas studied them thoughtfully, sensing that, like those distant storms, both danger and blessing were gathering on their horizon. Crickets began their evening chorus as shadows lengthened across the yard. The stallion's occasional nickering drifted from the barn, peaceful sounds that spoke of trust slowly earned. Thomas glanced at Taza, seeing not an outsider, but someone becoming family. Despite what the town might think, they sat together in companionable silence, watching the first stars appear above the darkening mountains. Whatever storms might come, Thomas knew in his heart they would face them together. The morning sun painted the eastern sky in stripes of gold and rose, chasing away the last stars. Thomas stood at the barn door, studying the black stallion with quiet satisfaction. The horse's coat gleamed from their early brushing, and its eyes held none of the wild fear that had marked it at the auction. "Reckon it's time we showed folks what kindness can do," Thomas said to Taza, who was finishing the morning chores. Taza paused, leaning on his pitchfork. "You will ride him to town." "That I will." Thomas ran his hand along the stallion's muscled neck. "And you'll walk beside us if you've a mind to." The young Apache's face brightened with pride. He helped Thomas saddle the horse, their movements synchronized after days of working together. The stallion stood quietly, accepting the bit. Without resistance, Thomas's hip protested as he mounted, but he settled into the saddle with the ease of long practice. The reins lay loose in his hands as they set out, Taza walking alongside with a straight back and steady stride. The morning air was sweet with sage and promise. As they approached Trinidad, word of their coming spread ahead like ripples in a pond. Townsfolk emerged from shops and homes, gathering along the dusty street. Thomas kept his seat relaxed, letting the stallion's hooves mark an unhurried rhythm on the packed earth. "Would you look at that?" someone whispered. "That's the same horse that nearly killed Jim Watson's boy." The stallion's ears flicked at the voices, but remained calm, matching its steps to Taz's pace. A small girl in a blue pinafore broke free from her mother's grip and clapped her hands in delight. The sound sparked a ripple of soft cheers from others in the crowd. "Ain't that something?" old Pete Miller called from the barbershop doorway. "Never thought I'd see that beast walking peaceful as a plow horse." Not all faces showed approval. Several men crossed their arms and muttered darkly about Thomas Harper's foolishness. Yet even they couldn't deny the transformation before them, the feared stallion moving with fluid grace. Guided by the lightest touch, Pastor Duggan stood outside the church, watching their progress down the street. When Thomas and Taza passed, the preacher's weathered face creased in a smile, and he offered a slow nod of approval. Thomas touched his hat brim in response, noting how the pastor's acceptance carried weight with the watching crowd. They reached the Mercantile without incident. Thomas dismounted smoothly, though his hip twinged at the movement. The stallion stood ground-tied, head lowered contentedly, while Thomas and Taza went about their business. Several children crept closer to admire the horse, and Thomas noticed how Taza watched them with gentle eyes, occasionally offering a quiet word of caution when they got too near. What Thomas also noticed, but chose not to acknowledge, was Clive Morton's shadow in the alley beside the bank. The wealthy rancher's jaw was tight as he observed their success, and his eyes held something darker than mere disapproval. The ride home was peaceful, with Taza sharing stories of his people's horse training. Wisdom. The stallion seemed to know its way now, picking carefully around the worst ruts in the road. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was lowering toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. That evening, Thomas stirred a pot of savory stew while Taza set their simple table. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the kitchen walls, and the familiar scents of sage, beef, and wood smoke filled the air. They had grown comfortable with each other's presence, no longer struggling to bridge the gaps in language and culture. As they ate, Taza spoke softly of his mother's song's melodies that told of rain coming to the desert, of horses running free under starlight. His voice carried a hint of longing that Thomas recognized all too well. My Sarah. She had her own songs, Thomas shared, surprising himself with the ease of speaking about his late wife. Hymns mostly, but she'd sing them soft as lullabies. Used to say a prayer could be a song, if your heart was in it right. Taza nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. My mother say same thing. Song is prayer, prayer is song. All one voice to Creator. They continued talking as night deepened around. the ranch house. Thomas found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken of in years. Sarah's garden. Her gentle way with injured animals, her unwavering faith, even when drought took their crops. Taza listened with quiet respect, occasionally offering his own. Stories of family and tradition. The lamp burned lower, its flame reflecting in the window glass. Beyond that reflection, the night was velvet dark and peaceful. Until it wasn't. It wasn't. Thomas noticed at first a strange brightening on the horizon, too early for dawn and too orange for moonrise. His words trailed off mid-sentence as understanding struck. Fire, he breathed. Already pushing back from the table, Tav was on his feet in an instant, following Thomas's gaze. Through the window, they could see it now, flames reaching skyward from the direction of the barn, their hungry light painting the night clouds crimson. Thomas's hips slowed him terribly as he hurried. Outside, Taza sprinting ahead. The heat hit them like a wall as they drew closer. Flames had already engulfed half the barn's roof, and smoke poured from every gap in the weathered boards. The animals? Thomas shouted, but Taza was already moving. The young Apache disappeared into the burning building, heedless of danger. Thomas heard the panic of trapped horses, the splintering of wood as burning beams shifted. Precious seconds crawled by as smoke billowed out the barn doors. Finally, Taza emerged, leading Thomas's old mule and 2 frightened horses. But the black stallion was not among them. Even as Thomas counted heads, he heard a mighty crash from inside the barn, followed by the sound of breaking wood. The stallion burst through the back wall in a shower of burning splinters, its dark coat painted orange by the flames. They could only watch as the magnificent horse cleared the fence in a single bound and disappeared into the darkness, driven by terror into the night. The fire's roar seemed to mock their loss, consuming years of stored hay and tools. Blackening the beams Thomas's own hands had raised decades ago. Taza stood at Thomas's shoulder, soot streaking his face, chest heaving from smoke and exertion. Together, they watched the barn burn, knowing there was too little water in the well to fight such a blaze. The heat dried the tears on Thomas's cheeks before they could fall in the distance. A rider's silhouette showed briefly against the flames before vanishing into the shadows. Thomas didn't need to see the man's face to know Morton's hand was behind this night's work. The wealthy rancher had chosen his revenge well. Striking at both property and pride, the fire painted everything in shades of orange and black, throwing harsh shadows across the yard. The rescued animals huddled together, eyes rolling white at the sound of burning timber. Thomas felt the weight of loss settle onto his shoulders. Yet when he looked at Taza alive, though smoke-stained, he knew the night could have taken far more. They stood vigil as the barn burned, watching years of labor turn to ash in the dark. Hours before dawn, the stallion's hoofprints led away into the night, a testimony to freedom born of fear. Somewhere in the darkness, the horse ran wild again, carrying with it all their hopes of showing Trinidad that trust could tame what force could not. Thomas stumbled through smoke and chaos, his lungs burning with every breath. The well bucket creaked as he hauled another load of water, his arms trembling from exhaustion. Each splash against the inferno seemed futile. The flames only roared higher, devouring decades of memories stored in the barn's weathered beams. "Taza," he called, out, voice rough from coughing. "Get clear of there." Through the billowing smoke, he saw Taza leading the last of the frightened horses. The young Apache's face was streaked with soot, his clothes darkened by ash. As he guided the panicked animals away from the blaze, Thomas noticed a terrible orange glow catching at Taza's sleeve. "Your arm," Thomas shouted. The fire Taza looked down in confusion. Then his eyes widened as flames licked up his shirt sleeve. Before he could react, Thomas crossed the distance between them with surprising speed. He tackled Taza to the ground, rolling him in the dirt as he stripped off, his own coat to smother the flames. The sound of crackling timber filled the night as they lay there panting. Thomas's hips screamed in protest, but he ignored it, focusing on Taz's burned arm. The skin was angry red where flames had touched it, blisters already forming. "We need to tend that," Thomas said, helping Taza to his feet. "Nothing more we can do here, anyway." They watched helplessly as the barn collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks toward the stars. The heat pushed them back step by step until they stood in the relative safety of the yard. The stallion's hoofprints led away into the darkness, their only sign of where the magnificent horse had fled. Inside the house, Thomas's hands shook as he poured clean water into a basin. He had treated burns before every rancher had, but his heart ached to see Taza trying to hide his pain. The young man sat silent at the kitchen table while Thomas gently cleaned the wound. "This all hurts some," Thomas warned, reaching for a jar of burn salve. Taza merely nodded, his jaw tight, as Thomas wrapped clean white cloth around Taza's arm. He noticed the young man's skin felt too warm to the touch. But whether from the fire or the beginning of fever, he couldn't tell. Dawn crept over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose. The barn was nothing more than smoking ruins now, black timbers thrust up like accusing fingers. Thomas and Taza sat at the breakfast table, neither touching the cold biscuits and coffee before them. The smell of ash clung to everything there, clothes, their hair, even the morning air itself. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the window, they saw the first of many curious neighbors riding past, slowing their horses to stare at the destruction. Their whispered words carried clearly in the morning stillness. "Divine judgment," one woman said, crossing herself. "The Lord won't abide such foolishness." "Harboring that Indian," another agreed. What did Harper expect? Thomas's hands clenched beneath the table, but he said nothing. Beside him, Taza sat straighter, dignity intact despite his pain. When Sunday morning came, Thomas debated staying home. But his father had taught him to face trouble head-on, so he hitched up the wagon. Taza insisted on coming too, though his fever had worsened overnight. The church felt different today. As they walked down the aisle, people shifted in their seats, leaving empty pews around them like an island of isolation. Thomas helped Taza sit, noting how the young man's skin burned beneath his touch. Pastor Duggan stood at the pulpit, his usual warm presence somehow diminished. When he prayed for the congregation, his words came hesitant and stilted. "Lord, we ask your guidance in these trying times. Help us understand your will when circumstances challenge our understanding." Thomas kept his eyes closed, but he felt the weight of stares upon him. When he finally looked up, he met Clive Morton's satisfied smirk from across the aisle. During the final hymn, Morton made his way over, speaking just loud enough for nearby worshippers to hear. "Shame about your barn, Harper," he said, false sympathy dripping from every word. "But a man reaps what he sows. Maybe next time you'll think twice about going against the natural order of things." Heat rose in Thomas's chest, not from shame, but from anger. Yet before he could respond, Taza swayed beside him, nearly falling. The young man's face had gone gray beneath its copper tone, his bandaged arm held tight against his body. Thomas didn't wait for the benediction. He helped Taza from the pew, supporting him as they walked past disapproving faces toward the door. The whispers followed them out into the sunlight. That evening, Thomas sat alone on his porch, the familiar weight of his Bible heavy in his lap. But he couldn't bring himself to open it. The events of the past days pressed down on him like a physical burden. "Lord," he whispered into the gathering darkness, "did I err in showing mercy?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Taza's fevered murmuring. The young man had grown worse as the day progressed. his dreams filled with Apache words Thomas couldn't understand. But some phrases needed no translation the way Taza called for his horse, voice breaking with loss. Thomas rocked slowly in his chair, remembering the stallion's trust, Taz's grateful smile. The brief moment when it seemed love might overcome fear. Now the barn lay in ashes. His reputation burned with it, and a young man suffered for the sin of accepting kindness from the wrong hands. The stars emerged one by one. But Thomas found no comfort in their familiar patterns tonight. His faith, usually as solid as the hills themselves, felt as uncertain as smoke in the wind. The Bible remained closed in his lap, its well-worn pages holding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. In the bunkhouse, Taza called out again, his voice thin with fever. Thomas pushed himself up, his hip protesting the movement. Whatever doubts plagued him, he knew one truth: mercy wasn't mercy at all if it turned back at the first sign of trouble. He limped toward the bunkhouse, ready for another long night of tending burns and fever. The town's judgment would keep until morning. Right now, there was work to be done, and Thomas Harper had never been one to leave a task unfinished. Inside, he found Taza tangled in sweat-soaked blankets, his skin hot to the touch. The bandaged arm had begun to swell, angry red streaks climbing toward his shoulder. Thomas wet a cloth with cool water and placed it on the young man's forehead, just as he had done for his own son so many years ago. "Hold on, son," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could catch it. "Just hold on." Through the window, he could see the charred remains of the barn, black against the star-filled sky. The night wind carried the bitter scent of ash, mixing with the sharp smell of fever sweat and healing salve. Thomas settled in for his vigil, knowing that sometimes the hardest test of mercy came not in the giving, but in standing by it when the whole world seemed to stand against you. Thomas woke before sunrise, his neck stiff from sleeping in the wooden chair beside Taz's bed. Every muscle protested as he pushed himself up, his bad hip nearly buckling. The young man's fever still raged, turning restless dreams into mumbled Apache words. Outside, the morning air carried the lingering smell of ash. Thomas surveyed the charred ruins of his barn, heart heavy but determined. He had spare lumber stacked behind the house, not enough for a full barn, but perhaps enough to build temporary pens for the remaining livestock. His old mule watched from the paddock as Thomas began sorting through the blackened timbers. Some might be salvageable. He worked methodically, setting aside pieces that could be reused, his limp growing more pronounced with each trip. The sun climbed higher, beating down on his shoulders as he dragged posts and planks into place. By midday, sweat soaked through his shirt, and his hip felt like it was on fire. Still, he pressed on. The animals needed shelter, and the work kept his mind from darker thoughts. From inside the house came the sound of Taz's coughing, harsh, wet sound that made Thomas's chest tighten with worry. He paused only long enough to check on the young man, whose skin burned hotter than the morning. "Son," Thomas knew he needed to do something more. In his kitchen cupboard, he found dried willow bark, an old remedy his wife had sworn by. He set water to boil, then crushed the bark into small pieces, remembering her gentle hands performing the same task years ago. "Here now," he murmured, lifting Taz's head. "Small sips, son. It'll help with the fever." Taz's cracked lips parted, accepting the bitter tea. Most dribbled down his chin, but Thomas persisted, patient as he'd been with the stallion. When the cup was empty, he dabbed the spills away with a clean cloth, noting how Taz's bandaged arm had swollen further. The days fell into a grinding rhythm. Thomas rose with the sun, tending to essential chores, feeding animals, hauling water, rebuilding what he could. Every few hours, he returned to Taz's bedside, coaxing more willow bark tea between the young man's lips. At night, he dozed in the chair, Bible in his lap, waking at every restless movement or fevered cry. When the mail rider finally brought letters from his Denver suppliers, Thomas's hope fell. Lumber shipments were delayed 2 weeks at least. He stood in his dooryard, the papers crumpling in his grip, watching storm clouds gather over distant peaks. Pastor Duggan's buggy arrived that afternoon, wheels crunching over the scattered ash. The preacher's face was drawn with concern as he followed Thomas inside, eyes taking in the sick room's sparse conditions. "The town's been talking," Duggan said quietly, after offering a prayer over Taz's still form. "Morton's been stirring things. Up at the saloon, people are scared, Thomas." "They're saying," he trailed off, adjusting his collar. "Saying what?" Thomas's voice was rough from lack of sleep. "That harboring him brings danger to all of us. That the fire was just the beginning." Dugan sighed heavily. "The town's patience wears thin, old friend." Thomas straightened in his chair, ignoring the protest from his hip. "And what does the good book say about patience, Pastor?" "About mercy." Duggan touched Taz's fever-hot forehead, making the sign of the cross. "It also speaks of wisdom, Thomas, of counting the cost." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "I'll pray for you both, but be careful." After the buggy disappeared down the road, Thomas stood in the empty house, feeling the weight of isolation press down. "Lord," he whispered, "toward the rafters, I need your strength now. Help this boy heal. Send that horse home." The only answer was Taz's labored breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. That evening, as Thomas stirred a pot of thin soup, he heard hoofbeats approaching. His heart leaped. Could it be the stallion? He grabbed his lantern and limped outside as fast as his hip would allow. But there in the yard stood only his old mule, somehow worked loose from its tether. The beast gazed at him with liquid brown eyes, as if apologizing for raising false hope. Thomas's shoulders slumped as he led the animal back to its post, checking the knots twice this time. Inside, he slumped into his bedside chair, bone-weary. Taza tossed in fever dreams, the sheets soaked through again. Thomas changed them with practiced care, his movements gentle despite his exhaustion. The Bible lay unopened on the table, its pages seeming to hold reproach rather than comfort. Hours crept past midnight. Thomas dozed fitfully, starting awake at every change in Taza's breathing. The young man's fever burned so hot now that Thomas could feel it radiating inches away. He pressed cool cloths to Taz's forehead, neck, and chest, praying and whispered. Desperation between each touch, just before dawn. When the sky outside was still ink-dark and star-scattered, something changed. Taza's restless movements stilled. His breathing eased. Thomas laid a cautious hand on his forehead and felt cooler skin beneath his palm. "Water," Taza whispered, his first coherent word in days. Thomas's hands shook as he helped him drink. "Thank the Lord," he murmured, watching color slowly return to the young man's face. "Thank the Lord." "Thank you," Taza managed, his voice weak but clear. His good hand found Thomas's wrist, squeezing briefly before exhaustion pulled him back to real sleep this time, not fever dreams. Relief washed through Thomas like a flash flood after drought. He sank to his knees beside the bed, finally. Opening his Bible, the pages fell naturally to the Psalms, worn smooth by years of searching fingers. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the hills, their wild voices carrying through the pre-dawn stillness. Thomas read quietly, letting David's ancient words of praise and gratitude wash over him. Morning light began to pearl the eastern sky, promising another day of work ahead. But for now, in this moment, he simply gave thanks for mercy that endured when strength failed, for healing that came in its own time, for the strange ways God knit broken things back together. The sound of Taza's easy breathing filled the room, punctuated by the distant coyote's song. Thomas closed his eyes, still kneeling, and let exhaustion have its way at last. His hip would make him pay for this position later, but some prices were worth paying. Some mercies were worth any cost. The morning dawned clear and crisp. Sunlight, painting the weathered boards of Thomas's farmhouse in shades of gold. Inside, he helped Taza button his cleanest shirt, the young man's burned arms still wrapped but healing. Though fever had left him weak, determination brightened Taza's eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked, adjusting his own Sunday collar. "Town ain't been kind lately." Taza nodded, his jaw set. "I stand with you." Thomas's throat tightened at the simple declaration. He checked his pocket watch, 7:30, early enough to make the morning service if they left now. His hip protested as he gathered their Bibles, but he pushed through the discomfort. Some burdens were worth bearing. Outside, dew sparkled on the grass as Thomas hitched his old mule to the wagon. The animal's ears flicked back and forth, sensing the tension in its master's movements. Thomas spread a clean blanket over the wooden seat, then helped Taza climb up. The young man moved carefully, his strength not fully returned. The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, following the rutted road toward town. Neither spoke much during the journey. Thomas rehearsed words in his mind, prayers mixing with memories of his son. Beside him, Taza watched the passing landscape with quiet intensity as they approached Trinidad. Church bells began their measured toll. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Already, townspeople walked the boardwalks in their Sunday best, heads turning as the wagon passed. Some quickly looked away. Others stared openly, their disapproval clear as morning light. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near the church steps. The white clapboard building seemed to loom larger than usual, its steeple sharp against the blue sky. He climbed down first, his bad hip making him clumsy. When he turned to help Taza, he saw Morton watching from the church porch, whispering to a cluster of well-dressed ranchers. "Steady now," Thomas murmured, supporting Taza's good arm as they climbed the steps. The young man's face was pale, but composed, his back straight despite weakness. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with hushed conversations that died away as they entered. Thomas felt the weight of every stare as he guided Taza to a pew near the middle. A woman in the row ahead gathered her skirts closer, as if contact might soil them. Several families shifted to create empty spaces around them. Pastor Duggan stood at the pulpit, his expression carefully neutral as he called the congregation to worship. The opening hymn rose hesitantly, voices uncertain. Thomas sang clear and strong, though his hands trembled slightly on the hymnal. Beside him, Taza followed the unfamiliar words with careful attention. After the second hymn, Thomas squeezed Taza's shoulder gently and stood. His hips screamed protest as he limped to the front, but he kept his head high. "Pastor," he said quietly, "might I have a word with the congregation?" Dugan hesitated, glancing at the packed pews. "Thomas, are you certain?" "This is wise." "No, sir, I ain't certain at all, but it needs saying." The pastor stepped aside, allowing Thomas to take his place. The pulpit felt massive, like it might swallow him whole. Thomas gripped its edges, drawing strength from the solid wood. His voice quavered as he began, but grew steadier with each word. "Most of you knew my boy, James. He rode with the cavalry, proud as any son could be. When word came of his death in the Apache Wars, I let bitterness take root in my heart." Thomas paused, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. "I blamed them all, every native soul, guilty or innocent. Carried that hate like a stone in my chest for years." Movement caught his eye. Morton, shifting restlessly in his seat, face dark with scorn. Thomas pressed on. "Then God sent me that wild stallion, fierce as my own anger. And he sent Taza, who had more right to hate than I ever did. Through them both, I learned what mercy truly costs. His voice cracked slightly. This is my repentance, friends. My chance to make right what bitterness poisoned. The sanctuary was utterly still. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Then Morton stood, his expensive suit rustling. "Words, Harper," he drawled, "but they won't change what he is. You can dress him up, bring him to church, teach him scripture. He'll still be a prison Indian." Thomas straightened, ignoring the protest from his hip. "What God has tamed, no man should scorn. That goes for horses, hearts, and souls alike." "Oh, you're a fool," Morton spat. "That horse will kill you, and this savage will probably help." "The only savage here," Thomas replied firmly, "is the one who burns barns in the night and calls it justice." A gasp rippled through the congregation. Morton's face flushed dark red, but before he could respond, Pastor Dugan stepped forward. "Brothers," he said firmly, "this is God's house. Let us remember that before our tongues run away with us." Gestured for Thomas to step down, then launched into his prepared sermon. Thomas made his way back to the pew, each step an effort. Taza gripped the wooden seat before him, knuckles white but head unbowed. His presence spoke louder than any word's dignity. In the face of scorn, patience against prejudice. The rest of the service passed in a fog of tension. Some folks kept their distance as they filed out afterward, while others nodded quietly or touched Thomas's sleeve in passing. Morton stormed past with his family, spurs jingling against the wooden steps. On the porch, Thomas and Taza paused too. Let others disperse. The morning sun had grown warm, promising another hot day ahead. A few neighbors lingered nearby, speaking in low voices. Thomas recognized old Jake Miller, who had helped fight the barn fire, and widow Sarah Collins, who sometimes brought extra eggs by the farm. "Reckon you spoke true in there," Jake said finally, touching his hat brim, "about mercy and such." Sarah nodded, her lined face gentle. "James would be proud, Thomas. He always did believe in doing right, no matter the cost." Tears pricked Thomas's eyes as he helped Taza down the steps. They climbed into the wagon slowly, both weary from more than just physical strain. As Thomas flicked the reins, he felt a peculiar lightness in his chest, as if some long-carried burden had finally been set down. The drive home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Taza dozed against Thomas's shoulder, worn out but peaceful. The mule plodded steadily, dust rising from its hooves. Behind them, the church bells tolled noon, their bronze voices carrying across the valley. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. His hip ached fiercely, but his heart felt easier than it had in weeks. Inside, he could hear Taza moving about, his soft footsteps steady and sure. Peace settled over the farm like a blessing, broken only by the evening song of meadowlarks. Thomas closed his eyes, breathing deeply. For the first time since the fire, since James's death, since bitterness first took root, he felt truly, completely at rest. Thomas and Taza fell into a quiet rhythm as days passed. The steady thud of hammers echoed across the homestead as they worked side by side, mending broken fence posts and hauling fresh-cut lumber. Though most townspeople kept their distance, a few neighbors showed kindness in small ways. Old Jake Miller left a stack of planks by the gate one morning. Widow Collins brought a paper sack filled with iron nails. Taza's strength returned slowly but surely. One morning, Thomas caught him smiling faintly while brushing down the mule, the first real smile since the fire. They rode out at dawn to search for the stallion, following hoofprints into the rocky foothills. But the trail went cold, leaving only empty silence in the high country. Back in town, Thomas's heart sank when he found the telegram waiting at the mercantile. Army agents were asking questions about Taz's location. That evening, lantern light cast long shadows as Thomas broke the news. "If they find you, they'll take you back." Taza lifted his chin. "Then I will not hide. Horse must come back, or none of this matters." Thomas admired the young man's courage, even as worry gnawed at him. That night, wolf song echoed from the ridge. Both men lay awake, listening to the haunting calls, knowing danger circled ever closer. Yet, in their shared silence, their bond only grew stronger. A week crept by like molasses, each day wound tight with worry. Thomas's hands stayed busy, showing Taza how to notch pine beams and raise the frame of a small shed. The work went slower than usual, with supplies dragging late on creaking wagons. Yet something had shifted in town. A few neighbors rode out to help, bearing tools and strong backs. Even crusty old Pete Matthews came, muttering about Christian duty while he hammered. One evening, just as Thomas was hanging his work gloves, rapid footsteps pounded up the trail. Jimmy Carter, the blacksmith's boy, burst into the yard chest. Heaving, "Your horse." He gasped. Down by Wilson's Creeks, saw him drinking. Hope blazed in Taz's eyes. At first light, they mounted up, following hoofprints pressed in morning dew. Across the river, they spotted him. The stallion stood proud despite his scorched mane. Watching them with wary eyes, Taza began humming soft and low, an Apache melody that drifted across the water. The stallion's ears pricked forward, remembering. Step by careful step, they drew him near until his velvet nose brushed Taza's palm. Their triumph was short-lived. As they led the horse through the ranch gate, Clive Morton appeared with 3 hired guns. His voice cut like a knife. "That horse belongs in my stable." Thomas planted his feet, one hand steady on his cane. "This animal stays right here." Morton's face darkened. "If not by muscle, then by law. Mark my words." He wheeled his horse away, leaving dust and threat hanging in the air in the corral. The stallion tossed his head, finally home as evening shadows lengthened across the yard. The following Sunday dawned clear and bright. Thomas straightened his collar, nodding to Taza. Together, they led the stallion down Trinidad's dusty Main Street, heads held high. Townsfolk gathered along the boardwalks, their whispers spreading like wind through wheat. The stallion stood peaceful as morning dew, his head lowered while Thomas's weathered hand rested on his gleaming neck. Taza walked with quiet dignity, the reins loose in his grip. The crowd's murmurs faded to silence. Then, awe. Pastor Duggan stepped from the church steps, his voice gentle. Perhaps God tamed more than a horse today. Morton pushed through the crowd, face flushed. Justice demands we seize this beast. But Marshal Lowe touched his badge, speaking firm and clear. The law sees no theft here. Morton stormed away, defeated. One by one, townspeople drew closer. Children reached up to stroke the stallion's velvet nose, their laughter breaking weeks of tension. Thomas's eyes grew misty as he whispered to Taza, "Looks like the tide's turning." That evening, wagon wheels creaked up their trail. Neighbors arrived bearing tools and lumber, ready to help rebuild. Taza watched in wonder as men who had once turned their backs now worked shoulder to shoulder with Thomas, raising beams in the golden light. Lanterns cast warm circles in the growing dark as voices lifted in song. Summer painted the valley in warm golds and greens as Thomas and Taza worked side by side, setting the last boards of the new barn. Neighbors had come day after day, hammering and lifting until the structure rose proud against the sky. The stallion grazed peacefully nearby, his coat gleaming in the sun. Their days fell into comfortable rhythm. Morning chores gave way to shared meals, and evenings found them gathered around the kitchen table. Taza bent over Thomas's worn Bible, carefully sounding out verses by lamplight. Thomas watched with quiet joy, the deep lines of his face softening. With pride, one evening, Thomas led Taza to the fence line where the stallion dozed. Resting his hand on the horse's flowing mane, Thomas spoke softly. "I thought I'd lost all family when my boy fell. Turns out God gave me more than I dared hope." Taza's eyes shone in the fading light. "You are my father now," he said simply. Thomas gripped his shoulder, tears gleaming. Together they walked back toward the welcoming glow of home, crickets singing. In the grass, the stallion's gentle nicker followed them, no longer wild but transformed by mercy. In town, the suspicious whispers had given way to respectful nods. Thomas Harper's bold choice at auction becoming his finest legacy. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.